Well, hello everybody. My name is Jeff Jarvis, and I'm presenting LeSueur County Historical Society today. And we have put together a three-part artist series on the history of the three most famous artists from LeSueur County. LeSueur County Historical Society has been in existence since 1967, and at that time they were given a huge art collection that they've been maintaining ever since. And since the museum has been under renovation, they decided to do some public relations work and bring the artwork from the collection out to the public in a video series. So this is the first of the three-part history series, and it's featuring Adolf Dehn. So at this point we will just start going into the slides, which will show the artwork of Adolf's. Let's talk a little bit about the Dehn art collection. As I mentioned before, the collection as it sits was donated by Virginia Dehn, Adolf's widow, and that was in 1967. So the collection has been maintained ever since at the LeSueur County Historical Society. There's three main artists in the collection: Adolf Dehn, who we're illustrating today, Roger Price and David Maas, and one other fellow that was Adolf Dehn's student, you might say, was Lloyd Herfindahl, and he's the one that started the Albert Lee Art Center, and he's known as the muralist of Albert Lee. So more about him some other time. But anyway, with these three artists, you see a lot of their artwork that mirrors what's happening in society at the time that they're painting, especially Adolf. Here's a photograph of Adolf Dehn painting in a studio some paintings that he did while he was on the Guggenheim Fellowship traveling around the world. But what we're going to examine on this slide is the three things that really have distinguished him among other artists. Adolf was fluid in three major styles of doing art, three mediums: lithography, watercolor, and cassine. Cassine is just like a opaque watercolor. Adolf's work over 50 years had a theme running through it, and it was either works about nature or works about the nature of people. So nature and the nature of people were the two themes that ran through his work. And we'll examine more about that as we go along. Caricature is the first of the three major styles that Adolf helped set up, establish, or whatever. But typically when one thinks about caricature, you think of artwork of yourself that you have done at like a circus or a fair. But in Adolf's case, with his travels, he did a lot of work with caricature, as just like anybody would just sketch in a sketchbook. That was his preferred medium, his preferred style. And what caricature does, it's art of a real person which exaggerates certain features of that person, but still retains a likeness. In this artwork of Adolf, it's called Broadway Parade, 1935, it's a lithograph of a New York scene, and there's an underlying message in this work, which means it's satire. Satire is caricature, a style of caricature that contains a moral message. And caricaturists before Adolf actually used this medium to lampoon political figures or what have you. But in Adolf's case, he used caricature and satire to express his humor or to show the irony of life. And in this case, it's a parade of nuns walking down the street, which is something you don't see every day. But in juxtaposition in the background, you have all these ladies in these expensive full-length furs and men in three-piece suits and top hats. So he was recording a moment in time that he found to be just a little ironic, and we get to enjoy it today. American regionalism was the second major American art style that Adolf worked in. And in this particular painting, called August in Minnesota, from the collection, shows these really heartwarming scenes from the heartland, of course, so it would be heartwarming. But the work was put together by artists at this time during the days of the Great Depression, lingering dark days. And the artwork and the paintings helped bring about a reassurance to people that viewed the painting that everything is going to be okay, widely appreciated for its calming influence. And you'll notice that in the top right corner, American Gothic by artist Grant Wood shows the older couple posed in front of their Gothic home, Gothic farm, with the pitchfork. It's an iconic scene. And the painting below that is by Norman Rockwell, and that's Freedom from Want, one of a series of his paintings. And these are all these artists concentrated on the heartland, agriculture, family, just the basic values that America had to go back to during these times. And final area that Adolf worked in, the theme of social realism, the art movement called social realism, shows a southern scene from a black family's farm. And you'll notice that a lot of the figures are in caricature. As I mentioned before, he did a lot of work in caricature. That was his style. But in social realism, the new phrase, "it is what it is," really applies, because there's no attempt to make a scene look any different than what it is. And in this scene, it's really poor. It shows the working class and people in the lower socioeconomic part of society. And this style of art was really highly encouraged by the WPA programs of the 1920s and 30s. And you'll notice that this particular social realism movement was global. It wasn't American only, like American realism, or excuse me, American regionalism. It was worldwide. And you'll, in the Migrant Mother photograph by Dorothea Lange in the top right corner, you'll see the hardened look on that young lady's face with her family in the background. And it was a hard scrabble existence, and there was no attempt to make it look anything different than what it was. Social realism was, it was portrayed in all genres, film, painting, and drawing. And in film, think of Grapes of Wrath and how stark and real that movie was, and compare that to social realism, and you'll see social realism paintings, and you will notice that there's a lot of similarities. So the effects of war and depression and the bad economy are very real parts in this artwork. Now that we've learned about the three major movements of work that Adolf worked in, let's examine and talk about some of Adolf Dehn's early days. And we'll start out with this scene here at the rail yard with the muskrat furs. Adolf Dehn's parents were into hunting and trapping and fishing. They really lived off the land. And in the 1880s, 1890s of Waterville, incidentally, Adolf was a Waterville native. I'm not sure if I mentioned that earlier, but Adolf's grandparents came from Prussia seeking freedom, and they settled in LeSueur County at German Lake. The parents were charter members at the German Lake Lutheran Church, which is still standing. It's a beautiful congregation. So they came to the USA seeking religious and political freedom. They wanted peace and not war. And they were pacifists. They didn't want to support war in any shape, style, or form. So like I mentioned, the father trapped and hunted and fished, and they were very tied to the land. His father was a firm atheist. He didn't believe in the existence of God. And the mother was a church-going Lutheran lady at the German Lutheran Church. And they raised Adolf to have a mind of his own and to develop his own beliefs, political and religious beliefs. So anyway, back to this photograph. This is an image off a plate glass negative that I was able to get my hands on, and I made a print of it for this particular presentation because it shows what it was like, you know, in the late stages of the fur trade. Muskrats were the last things that were trapped out. There still is a lot of muskrats, being that we have so many lakes and marshes in the area. And I'm not sure what they brought in, but it was a livelihood, and the furs were taken off the bodies of the animals and stretched, dried out, and put in gunny sacks and brought by wagon to the railroad. And that's what you see here is some of the trappers doing the negotiation pricing or whatever with the person in the flat white hat there with the suit on. He was probably the buyer. So anyway, it just gives you a flavor of what Adolf's father had to go through to make a living. Adolf's early days on Lake Tatanka in Waterville, you know, this photo shows that he had a lot of friends, and one friend in particular is the lady in the middle. The young lady is Wanda Gog from New Ulm, and her and Adolf became really good friends. For years they were friends, and when Adolf started doing his drawings as a late teen, he and Wanda did artwork together, and if a person was to compare their artwork from that time, you see a lot of similar stylistic features, which is really just kind of an interesting thing. It's not too far-fetched when you think about it, like when two kids grow up together or hang out a lot together, they begin to talk alike and act alike and draw alike, and that's exactly what happened. So being that Adolf's family was situated next to Lake Tatanka, they spent a lot of time in the water, and in later times, Adolf's parents had a resort in that same part of Waterville right next to Osborne's mink farm. So as Adolf, Dehn, and Wanda Gog stayed together, hanging out, they went to school together in Minneapolis, and they became lovers, and they were together for a long, long time until Adolf absconded for Europe. So Adolf's first attempts at doing artwork were ink sketches. He was able to get a hold of some ink from a mail order catalog, whether it was Sears or Montgomery Ward's, I don't remember, but anyway, they had an art section in the catalog, and he ordered up some paper and ink in that early day, and I suppose the order arrived by train. The train service was pretty big in Waterville in that day. And these two pieces of art here that show the man and the woman driving together and the cosmopolitan lady on the right were a couple of his first attempts, and these ink drawings are part of the collection at LeSueur County. They were hand-picked by Virginia Dehn to reside in LeSueur County because that's where Adolf did the work. So the first piece of artwork showing the woman driving, 1911, that's about the same time cars started appearing on the streets of Waterville. And you'll notice that, the title is When Woman Drives. It's like, okay, so what happens, right? So the man has his hand to his chin, and he's probably wondering how this experience is going to work out. And the woman looks pretty self-confident. So anyway, it's just kind of an interesting period of time, a timepiece that shows a real typical scene of what happens when people start driving, whether they're man or woman, when the car first comes around. The Gibson girl artwork from 1914 shows Adolf's desire to do illustration of these fancy ladies in their high fashion with the peacock plumes and the bags and things like that. And I think I read that he was interested in fashion design, and so that's kind of a reflection of what that looked like. So anyway, his work at this period of time is really nice and tight, really tight ink work and very realistic, whereas his later work is much, much looser, and we'll be seeing that shortly. Pause. When Adolf graduates from high school, he is the class valedictorian. He's a smart young man and very talented, and he wins a scholarship to the Minneapolis College of Art and Design, which at that time was the Minnesota Art Institute, I believe. So he gets his feet wet in school, and it's a lifelong dream, and he knows exactly what he wants to do for a livelihood as a youngster. So he's fulfilling a dream by going to college. But what happened is World War I started, and the Selective Service got on board, and he was drafted. So what happened was he showed up in basic training, and he gave a letter to his commanding officer saying that he was a conscientious objector. And so he was basically taken out of the service. He wasn't taken out of the service, but he was put into a less active role. And what he did was he was an art instructor for the wounded in a hospital for a year, and then he did another stretch of time doing a different assignment. But he did fulfill his duty, even though he did not believe, his beliefs wouldn't allow him to participate in war. He learned those beliefs from his parents, and the parents learned it from, they brought the beliefs with them from Prussia. They had Prussian values. So anyway, at this time, Adolf came home in 1919, and on the right photo there it shows him dressed in the high boots and with his army hat and long wool coat, and that's a picture in Waterville. But he didn't stick around too long. He was off to New York because he also won a scholarship there with Wanagag, and they both utilized that scholarship at the Art Student League in New York. Adolf was introduced to lithography, which is a very popular medium at the time, and we will talk more about the lithography process after this slide. But in this first work that he did, which shows a back alley scene, there's several individuals digging in garbage cans for food, and the lady on the left is a higher society person than the middle lady who's got a shawl over her head, and the third person on the right is an older lady. And anyway, it's a pretty dismal scene. You got the cat digging through the garbage, and so they're foraging for supper, and Adolf called it the harvest. So it just shows that he has kind of a sense of humor about this, and there'll be more to come on that. You'll see that his sense of humor shows through in odd ways. But in this particular style of work, Adolf stretched the lithostone medium to show a lot of lights and darks. And in the master's work of centuries past, that's called chiaroscuro. Anyway, that is the play of light against dark, and he mastered that technique. So another interesting thing was, part of being an artist is, it's not just doing art and throwing the art in a drawer and forgetting about it. Adolf found out that there's exhibits of work as you go along in your career, and this was one of the pieces that was put on display. So Adolf was really, this was a pinnacle time for him because he found his love for lithography, and he used that to become famous, expressing himself in later years. Well, what we have here is an illustration showing how lithography works, and the two images on the bottom are lithostones. And lithography is actually a Greek word of, put two words together. Lithos is stone, and graphein is to write. So it's literally to write on stone. And I always thought it'd be much easier carrying around a sketchbook rather than a 30-pound limestone block of stone, but this was what they used back then for those that loved lithography. So what would happen is an artist would do a drawing and it would transfer it onto the smooth polished face of the stone, and so that resulting image was in reverse, so when it was printed it would be properly read. Okay, so it would be printing in reverse. So at that time, in the 1920s and 30s, a lot of people were doing these prints, and it was really, it wasn't really cost effective because the people that did the printing were experts in their field too, so they commanded a price to do a run of prints. Usually a run of prints was 20 or 25 prints. Anyway, so the ink would be rolled onto the stone, and because water was sprinkled on the stone, the ink would only stick to the image on the polished face of the stone. And then the whole works with the paper and the stone was run through a press, similar to a wringer washer roller system, and the paper was impressed upon the stone so hard that the ink would bleed into the paper. So the paper was peeled off, and there you go, you have yourself a print. Here we have a lithograph stone that Adolf worked on. And it's about a 25-pound stone. It's 3 or 4 inches thick. The top of the stone is polished smooth, and it has an image engraved into it. And you can see the black part is actually the positive part of the image that was inked. So this is one of the stones that is at the LeSueur County Historical Society Museum. And as soon as the museum gets renovated, this will be on display. So as Adolf made his way around New York, he found some jobs that paid pretty well, and there was a socialist magazine called The Liberator that aligned with his political beliefs, and this was just one of many illustrations that he did for the socialist magazine and others that showed, in this case, the age of petroleum and how he kind of guessed the future, kind of like a crystal ball, saying, hey, this is what's going to happen. I see big petroleum is coming to get us. And it was an amazing forethought that he had, because petroleum rules the world right now. But this artwork was done in 1921. So anyway, Adolf had a lot of political views, and he wasn't bashful about showing what he thought in his artwork. And it's one thing to do art, but when you use art to express your beliefs, that's a whole nother thing. So anyway, he did works like this to raise money to go to Europe to further his career. And he was still in his 20s, and pretty quick he would be a young man on the loose in Europe. As Adolf made his way in Europe, he spent a lot of time in Germany and other places, and he went to popular gathering places at the time, and they included places like the opera, different coffee cafes, and burlesque parlors, among all things. And in this particular drawing, it was an ink sketch he did of the Politician's Cafe, and it's done in that caricaturist style that I mentioned earlier that he was so fond of using. The characters are all exaggerated. I'm sure if one went back into 1923, you could compare this to photographs of the time and say, okay, well, this is so-and-so politician and whatnot, because a lot of his drawings did carry some similarities. But Adolf really enjoyed this style of work where he would go into these particular venues with his sketchbook and just participate in the moment by drawing the activity that was going on. So he captured a moment in time. Adolf didn't really use much for a camera or have much use for photography, because he believed that his eye and his sketchbook were his camera, and he could participate in life by pulling out his sketchbook wherever he was and recording a scene. In this scene that Adolf did, this was a lithograph. He probably did a sketch of this at the jazz club in Wien, Germany in 1926, and then went back to his studio to do the final work on the stone. Adolf really preferred doing sketches outdoors, quick sketches at these different venues or outdoors, and then he would do the finished work in his studio. He didn't like working outside of the studio much as far as finishing work. By this time, Adolf had been married, or he had just gotten married to Mira Ziparovich. She was a Russian dancer, and she loved, loved, loved jazz dancing. And they, her and Adolf were quite a pair, and he was deeply in love with her, and they traveled all about Europe together. So it's interesting to say that when I lived in Waterville, there was a Waterville man that got himself a Russian bride. So Adolf was probably the first guy to bring home to Waterville a Russian bride, and Axel was the second. But anyway, the Adolf really enjoyed doing caricatures of the jazz scene, and he did it so much that he was known as the king of the jazz age, you know, the jazz age satirist. And we'll see more about that as we go along here. There was a fair number of people that were disappointed in Adolf that he did so many scenes of from the burlesque parlors, but that's what he really enjoyed doing. He liked being in these scenes where there was a lot of activity, and his work often featured the burlesque parlors, but prostitutes and others, the pleasure seekers, you know, the people that enjoyed going to the burlesque parlors. And you'll see if you examine the artwork that it's more than just images of scantily clad women, but it's the pleasure seekers, the people that are attending these things, that's where the social commentary comes in. In 1929, Adolf returns to America with his Russian bride, and they initially go back to Waterville in LeSueur County and stay with his parents. But it's not long before Adolf and Mira decide that, you know, they're having a little bit of trouble financially, and that's one thing that happens when couples experience a lot of pressure from finances, whatever. You see a lot of relationships breaking up, and Adolf was pretty sure he wanted to keep traveling and doing art, and so there was some rumors flying around, or some rumblings of trouble in their marriage at this time in America. But as Adolf went back to New York to do artwork, he went back to the jazz clubs, and the Clam House in New York, 1930, he saw a lot of action that really made him happy in illustrating, in this case, the black singer bellowing out his songs with the white folk in the background. And here again, it was a scene of irony, because at that time there was a lot of segregation in America. So this is an image caught in time. One thing about Adolf was he had happy feet. He was here and he was there, and he was rubbing elbows with all these different people, important people, people that were influential. But his time back in Waterville, he did a lot of landscape scenes, and he took extra special care with his landscapes. And this is a scene looking south from Cicada Bay by the fish market, looking south, and immediately you see the old furniture factory there in the center, and the old water tower on the right side. And the scene looks pretty much the same today as it did back in 1932, except for the furniture factory, which is now the old nursing home. But in this scene, when Adolf was doing this scene, he had just gotten divorced from Mira, the Russian dancer, and she remained in the United States, and the time that she and Adolf had spent in the jazz club, she had developed a real intense desire to learn more about jazz dance, and she actually became an authority, a foremost authority in the United States on jazz dance. And you can Google her name. It's Mira Dehn, jazz dance. So she became an expert. She's gone now, but she made a name for herself. And so as we look at this particular drawing, this lithograph, the old expression applies: you can take the boy out of the country, but not the country out of the boy. And as famous as Adolf became in Europe, he still enjoyed going home, and he did beautiful artwork for us to remember. As we go along and view a couple more of Adolf's landscapes, here's another scene from Kilkenny, which is just north of Waterville. Adolf did the initial sketch for this in 1937. The original initial sketch for this is housed at the LeSueur County Historical Society. It's in the collection. It's a pencil drawing. And Adolf used that, the notes that were on that drawing, to develop this lithograph sketch. And this is a famous American regionalism piece. It shows the American heartland, a threshing scene. And one of the themes in American regionalism is agriculture. And so you don't see this type of scene anymore in the countryside, but we have Adolf's work to look back on and say, okay, well, that's the way they did it 70 years ago. So it's there's still a lot of agriculture that happens, and from that aspect, you know, it's relatable. You know, people still have to work hard, but you don't see shocks of corn and hay put up like that anymore either. And you really don't see farm ladies walking around in aprons in the field either, but that's pretty much what it must have looked like back in the 30s, because that's the way Adolf rendered it. So anyway, like I mentioned, this started out as a sketch on a page, and Adolf brought it back to a studio. He was quoted as saying he really didn't like fighting nature when he was doing his artwork. He didn't mind doing initial quick sketches, but he didn't like the rain and, you know, the different wind and variables that you had to contend with to do final artwork, and he kind of liked the controlled environment of his studio to do his final work. Adolf's love of landscape was the same in New York or in Waterville. This particular scene shows his command of doing landscapes. It's a spring painting of Central Park, and it's a watercolor. He just started doing watercolor about this time, 1938, 1940. And this particular painting is his absolutely most famous work. It's printed on umbrellas, hats, shirt, anything that can be printed on. The museum in New York has printed it. So Adolf captured the essence of this particular scene in time in Central Park, and the people that run the museum grabbed that image and they bought the painting, so they had the rights to use it for marketing Adolf and the New York Central Park. So I think what made this painting so famous is it really reflected the golden age of Manhattan, the spirit and the energy. And, you know, there's that juxtaposition of being able to find leisure time and relaxation in the center of the city. In the middle of all the hubbub, you still have people that are lounging about and relaxing and enjoying nature. while in the background you see all the skyscrapers and high-rises that suggest that it is the golden age of Manhattan. So it's a beautiful painting, and like other artists, he's done multiple renditions of this work in watercolor as well as lithograph and pen and ink too. So that's one thing we noticed in the collection at LeSueur County, is there's just so many different varieties of his work in this particular, with this subject matter. He was so fluid, how he would just go from watercolor to lithograph, colored lithograph using multiple stones, or just doing drawings. And it makes one wonder how he picked which medium to work in on which day. So as the days of the Depression moved on into the 1940s, Adolf kept up his work, and he was really doing well by the 1940s, and he arrived at the pinnacle. A lot of things came together for him at this stage of his career. He met Virginia Engelman, who would become his second wife, and she was quite a bit younger. Adolf liked younger ladies with the long legs, and you can see that in the bicycling photograph down below. And Adolf really loved Virginia, and they courted for a number of years and finally married in 1947. But before then, Adolf applied for a Guggenheim Fellowship, which is a prestigious award that comes with a lot of money. And with that money, that added money and the prestige, he decided he was going to do a watercolor tour of the United States. And at that time, he went from New York to California, and the whole watercolor tour was, when it was over with, Life magazine did a huge spread of all his paintings that he did, or the majority, or the best ones of the tour. And so the Life magazine of the 1940s was like having a million hits on your website today on the internet. Having something go viral is kind of similar to what that big spread in Life magazine's effect was. So it made Adolf his last name, Adolf Dehn, excuse me, he became a household name in the United States. And this particular photo shows Adolf at work. That's Adolf in the lower right corner. It shows the print studio with a live eagle in the back, and some of the publishers and whatnot. So it was really a wonderful time of life for him, with the Life 5-page spread, being freshly married, and it was just a real high point for Adolf in many, many ways. A lot of research for this presentation. I discovered that Adolf was known as the king of jazz satire, and he put so much time and energy going to these clubs. And the Savoy Club in Harlem was the biggest nightclub in New York at the time, 10,000 square foot dance floor. And what really set it apart in 1941 was blacks and whites came together. There was no discrimination. There was black entertainers with white entertainers, and black folks dancing with white, and it was just an oasis in a sea of racism, basically. So at that time, there was a lot of black entertainers that weren't allowed to perform in white venues, but the owner of the Savoy, the two owners, one was black and the other fellow was white, but he was Jewish. So they came together and they created the heart and soul of Harlem. This was the day and age before air conditioning, and these people were doing the jitterbug dancing, and a really physical style of dancing where bodies were thrown in the air, and it was just really there was just a vibe about the place, and they would get 5,000 or 6,000 people at this venue every night. And meanwhile in Harlem, in the alleyways around Harlem, there's people out on the stoops of the apartment buildings and on the stairways, you know, the metal stairways, just hanging out with their windows open. The windows were open in the Savoy, so all the sound drifted out into the neighborhood. So it was really, it truly was the heart and soul of Harlem. And Adolf was there recording it with many, many painted images and illustrations. So with Adolf's newfound fame, he was able to get a lot of military artwork. His beliefs about the military were softened because he didn't really like what was happening in Germany with the other Adolf, Hitler. He disliked Adolf with a passion, so he didn't have any trouble accepting commissions to do full-scale paintings for the U.S. military. And in this painting, the Convoy Brook, it shows the blimps in the air, and in the background on the sea, you can see the big tankers and battleships, and I believe the blimps were used for recon and just to protect the ships on the sea. But anyway, the military found a use for this work, and perhaps you might say it was propaganda, but the art wasn't just done for art's sake. It had a military, it provided a solution for the military too. So anyway, Adolf found a lot of work with the government this way, and his later years were much more comfortable than life of a starving artist. By the 1950s, Adolf was able to secure a second Guggenheim Fellowship that enabled him and Virginia to travel around the world this time, not just cross country. And he was able to record many, many different paintings and scenes from everyday life in Haiti, different places around the world. And in this particular painting, Twittering Gold shows a Haiti scene, and he did so many of these paintings with chickens flying in the air and ladies walking around with bowls on their head and whatnot, so bongos, and it's, you know, he's done in kind of a characteristic style. You know, you don't really see women with heads that small and bodies that large. But this painting is absolutely beautiful. It's at the LeSueur County Historical Society. It's about 3.5 feet long, and the beauty of it is it just glows. The painting glows. I'm not sure how he did it, but layers and layers of glazes showing the different colors glowing through is just beautiful. So so he documented his travels with the art, and the Haiti culture was probably the most represented in all of his paintings from that time. At the height of Adolf Dehn's expertise, he was hired by the French author Guy de Maupassant to do illustrations for his book, Selected Tales of Guy de Maupassant. And it's a set of 20 illustrations that really show Adolf's range of professionalism, and they're all done on lithographed stones and beautiful. They're scenes from everyday life. Some are fantasy, but most are scenes from that you would normally see. This particular one shows a horse and buggy with a man in a top hat sitting next to a lady, and who knows what they're talking about, but the illustrations were all keyed to the stories that they were positioned in the book. So it's really a pretty great book. I did buy the book off Amazon.com, and you can get it for little or nothing, and you have a whole set of 20 of his favorite illustrations, and they're very, very well done. So pass with that. You'll notice in this image on before you that there's quite a range of different marks and textures that Adolf put into this work of art. And this is actually a Valentine card, and believe it or not, it's a holiday card, but he may have done this work just to show his range of expertise and his ability to stretch the lithograph medium way beyond anything that's ever been done before. This makes him a pioneer. Perhaps some of you may have seen the praying hands illustration done in the Renaissance period by Albrecht Dürer. He was a German artist, but that particular scene of the praying hands was a lithograph, and it's starkly real as compared to this. This is decidedly abstract, two totally different pieces of work, but Adolf was known for stretching the medium way beyond whatever had been done before. So that makes him a pioneer, and a lot of people have learned from him over the years here. What often happens in America and elsewhere is different art movements become more popular, and this is what happened to Adolf. He was somewhat diminished when Expressionism became more popular. Artists like Jackson Pollock and William de Kooning became much more famous, and I'm not going to go into those styles just yet, but anyway, as a result of World War II, that's pretty much what triggered the movement towards Expressionism over American regionalism. People had gotten over the effects of the Depression and World War II, and it was really a different day and age in America post-World War II, and it was the beginning of the baby boom and a beginning of a new art medium, an art movement. So, but to Adolf's credit, he kept working and doing his work like he did, and his landscapes in Minnesota, though, were always popular, even to this day, but especially in 1940s and 50s. His work, not all of it was forgotten, but you know, what happens is when one art movement replaces another, it's a natural thing to happen that the previous is diminished. So anyway, last thing I want to say about this is Adolf's work is still very popular, and it's a vintage style of art that is really never going out of style. Here we show a picture of Adolf lounging in his studio, and he's all dressed up in a black suit and a tie, and he has a real look of contentment. This was picture was taken in the early 1960s, and he had weathered a lot of storms. He had the benefit of hindsight at this point. It was 2020, and he knew that his work was important. And the background of this image is his famous Central Park scene, and that is a collage that I put together just to show the couple of high points in his life. Adolf was a prolific artist of great range over several mediums. Of course, we talked about the three mediums: the drawing, lithography, and the watercolor painting. He became a master watercolorist, and he was a master lithographer, which in itself is a huge accomplishment, because there are some people that never become a master at anything. And here he was well known as a master of watercolor and lithography. His art is held in over 100 museums in America and abroad. Adolf authored 3 books, and they're like how-to books on how to replicate his pioneering innovations. And there's 2 Guggenheims to his credit. There are a lot of artists in the world that never get one, and Adolf received 2. So that was a result of being so prolific over so many years. And Adolf's biggest claim to fame, though, is he helped shape and define the 3 major art styles that we talked about: caricature, American realism, regionalism, and social realism. And he has a bundle of work that fit into all 3 of those categories. Stay tuned for more programs offered by LeSueur County Historical Society. We are doing Roger Price, the artist, and David Maas, the artist, in incoming programs. So those will all be available for you to view. Thank you very much. One of the important things that LeSueur County Historical Society does is we collect artifacts, and we also preserve the collection that has been gathered. And we were gifted this huge art collection with Adolf Dehn's work, Roger Price, Lloyd Herfindahl, and David Maas's work. And the work arrived to us in a lot of times dire shape. So we have ongoing fundraisers, as you can imagine, to fix up this work. So there are fundraisers that we are hosting to help preserve the collection, which amounts to reframing and putting conservation quality framing and matting on all the artwork that is in the collection. And we're doing fairly well, but there remains a lot of work to be done. So there's a link at the bottom of this, LeSueurCountyHistory.org, for the website, or you can email LeSueurCountyHistory.org for information on purchasing Adolf Dehn greeting cards or art print canvas reproductions of any of the work that you've seen on this presentation. So thank you for supporting LeSueur County Historical Society, and have a great day.